A velvet-lined wardrobe, a sealed mahogany box, and a single instruction etched in gold. To be handled by my daughter Anne. What Princess Anne found inside would shake the monarchy to its core. For months after Queen Elizabeth's funeral, her private quarters inside Windsor Castle remained untouched, sealed in silence, preserved as if time itself dared not move forward. No aides entered. No advisors sorted through her belongings. It was Anne, the daughter who had stood beside the Queen through thick and thin, who was finally granted permission to enter the room no one dared disturb. What she discovered wasn't a trunk of jewelry or state documents, it was something far more intimate. Behind layers of velvet, Anne found a sealed mahogany box, smooth, cold, and untouched. The brass plaque on its surface bore just a few simple words. To be handled by my daughter Anne. Not William, not Charles, Anne. Inside the box was a folded piece of parchment, aged but unmistakably real. The handwriting was Queen Elizabeth's, not typed, not notarized, but written in her own flowing script, the same signature that had graced royal declarations for over 70 years. This wasn't part of the public will that had been read after her passing. No, this was different, deeper, hidden, emotional, and tucked behind it, almost like an afterthought or a carefully planted secret, was another letter. Its edges fragile, its folds soft with time. On the back, just one phrase, "From Diana, for Mummy." Anne didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She read both letters in silence, her face unreadable, her hands steady. But inside, the storm had begun. Realizing the magnitude of what she held, Anne took no chances. She summoned two of the most trusted legal minds who had served the monarchy for decades. Both confirmed the document's authenticity. This was not fiction. This was a secret will, written in the Queen's final months, never filed, never spoken of. It wasn't about property or procedure, it was about legacy, about purpose, about truth. And Diana's letter wasn't ceremonial. It was raw, personal, and painfully direct. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It warned of the future. It named names. And it made clear what Diana feared most: the corrosion of the monarchy from within, if left in the wrong hands. This wasn't a legal loophole. It was a detonator. A revelation so potent it could fracture loyalties, shift alliances, and change the crown's future path. Queen Elizabeth had made a final move not with announcements, but with whispers of her private will and the hidden voice of Diana, locked away until now. But Anne wouldn't carry this burden alone for long. The next person to read Diana's words would be the man who had buried her, and buried her warnings too. It was supposed to be a private moment between siblings. Instead, it became a royal breakdown no aide dared speak of. Charles didn't faint. He shattered. Princess Anne, composed and unreadable, summoned King Charles to Balmoral under the guise of a private family matter. No cameras, no staff, no political entourage, just the brother and sister who had spent a lifetime circling each other in duty and silence. She handed him the sealed folder without a word, her face offering neither warning nor comfort. Charles, already wearied by the weight of the crown and whispers about his health, accepted the documents with mild confusion. But the moment his eyes met his mother's handwriting, the air changed. The Queen's words, penned just weeks before her death, were soft and maternal, but beneath that warmth lay unease. Elizabeth had not simply reminisced, she had questioned the path her son had taken, the face the monarchy now wore, and the shadows that still clung to the throne. As he continued reading, something in Charles's expression shifted. The letter's tone had turned from gentle recollection to guarded doubt. She had written of the future, but not in absolutes. Her words no longer addressed him directly. They began to drift towards someone else, someone Charles hadn't expected. And then came the second envelope. Different parchment, different script, a different voice entirely. His hands trembled as he recognized the signature. Diana. Her name wasn't typed, it was scrawled in the same pen that had once penned love letters, confessions, and grief-filled pleas. Charles hesitated, visibly pale, before unfolding it. The letter was raw, unfiltered, and devastating. Diana didn't hold back. She wrote of fears she had once kept hidden about Camila, about Charles's judgment, about a monarchy that might collapse under the weight of arrogance and tradition. And then came the name that pierced like a dagger: Catherine. Diana had seen her from afar, and sensed in her a strength that reminded her of herself before the palace walls closed in. She feared that if the monarchy ever had a chance at redemption, it would not come from the past, but from a woman willing to do the job without the need for glory. That woman, Diana wrote, was Catherine. The Queen, it seemed, had read and kept Diana's words all these years and followed them. Charles didn't cry. He whispered, "No, no, she wouldn't," as though trying to convince himself more than anyone else. But the collapse came quickly. His knees buckled. His hands dropped the letters. He fell not because of illness, but because something within him gave way. The illusion that he had always been the rightful center of the Queen's trust had crumbled. The room was quickly sealed. Royal doctors called in. Aides confiscated phones. Nothing about that moment would ever appear in an official statement, but the witnesses would never forget. This wasn't a physical episode, it was a reckoning. For the first time since ascending the throne, Charles asked himself a question he couldn't answer. Had his mother believed more in Catherine than in him? Had she, in her final act, chosen a different legacy than the one Charles had been born to fulfill? But while Charles lay broken, the one person who had been unknowingly anointed in both letters hadn't read a single word yet, and when William did, nothing could prepare him. No warning, no hint, just ink on parchment and a grandmother's voice from beyond choosing not just the crown's direction, but who truly deserves to wear it. When William received the envelope, there was no ceremony, no trumpets, no palace aides ushering him into a historic moment. Just a courier, a sealed letter, and the weight of generations folded neatly inside. He opened it with the expectation of warmth, a few final reflections from his late grandmother, maybe a line or two of comfort. But what met his eyes was something far more deliberate. It wasn't guidance. It was a declaration. And it began with a sentence that made his heart stop. "Catherine is the soul of the monarchy's next chapter." The words weren't poetic flattery. They were intentional, purposeful, and unmistakably final. For a man who had lived his life as the heir, whose every step had been choreographed in the shadow of the throne, this moment landed like thunder. The Queen hadn't consulted him. She hadn't hinted at her intent, or even acknowledged how this decision might reshape everything he understood about legacy. She hadn't spoken to his father either. She had spoken only to Anne and to the silence of the page. This wasn't about succession in the traditional sense. It was about the succession of spirit, of trust, of belief. And William, who had spent his life balancing protocol with humanity, suddenly saw his wife through a different lens. She hadn't just married into the monarchy, she had been chosen to guide it. It shook him more deeply than he could show. This wasn't betrayal, but it was revelation. And with that revelation came a wave of emotion that didn't surface publicly but pulsed beneath every breath he took. He didn't reach for his aides, he didn't call a meeting, he didn't even speak to Catherine yet. Instead, he dialed one number: Princess Anne. The conversation, according to palace insiders, was long, emotional, and life-changing. Whatever passed between the Queen's only daughter and her grandson remained behind closed doors. But something in William's demeanor shifted after that call. Those who knew him best said he seemed quieter, not defeated, but more aware, as if the burden of history had doubled and lightened at once. From that moment, William began to move differently. In public, he still walked beside Catherine, still spoke first at engagements. But in private, something subtle began to change. He started deferring in ways he hadn't before, letting Catherine take the lead in matters of modernization, in private royal councils, in quiet decisions that didn't require a crown to carry weight. He began stepping back, not out of weakness, but as if he finally understood that leadership wasn't always about standing in front. It was about recognizing when someone else was already carrying the torch, and that someone was his wife. There were no announcements, no declarations, but inside palace walls, the shift was unmistakable. A new balance was forming, one where William, the heir, didn't have to carry the future alone. He had someone beside him, someone the Queen had trusted enough to name without naming. And for William, that was no longer a threat. It was a gift, a reassurance, a revelation. But William wasn't the only one facing a new reality. For the woman chosen by two queens, her own journey had only just begun, and her silence was louder than any crown. No throne, no tiara, no announcement. But make no mistake, the Queen's final move was Catherine's silent coronation, written in ink and sealed in trust. For Catherine, there was no moment of dramatic revelation, no public reading of royal edicts, no golden crown placed upon her head in front of a cheering nation. Instead, it came quietly, invisibly, through the words of a grandmother who had seen it all. Queen Elizabeth, in her final private testament, didn't call Catherine Queen Consort. She didn't use titles or pomp. She called her something else, the quiet force. That single phrase echoed louder than any royal decree. It wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. It was the clearest sign yet that Elizabeth, who ruled with stillness and steel, had found her true successor not in blood, but in spirit. There had always been rumors of the Queen's fondness for Catherine, but what lay within that secret document proved far more deliberate. Hidden from the public, protected from politics, were the records of private meetings, handwritten notes, and confidential discussions between the Queen and her granddaughter-in-law. The two had shared more than just tea. They had shared visions. In their walks through the gardens of Windsor and their letters marked only for each other, Elizabeth had passed on a legacy not of power, but of purpose. In those quiet hours, a transition had begun. Not one of status, but one of responsibility. The Queen didn't ask Catherine to follow tradition. She asked her to shape it. Within the will, Elizabeth wrote instructions never meant for Parliament's floor. Catherine was to sit on specific advisory councils, receive ceremonial privileges once reserved for reigning monarchs, and most shocking of all, hold final influence over modernization decisions in the royal household. This wasn't a gesture. It was a repositioning, and the placement was unmistakable. Not above William, not below, but beside him, equal in purpose, equal in expectation, and perhaps, in the Queen's eyes, stronger in resolve. It hadn't happened overnight. Princess Anne had been watching for years, quietly mentoring from the shadows. She saw in Catherine what few others could: consistency without fanfare, strength without spectacle. Anne didn't care for charm or headlines. She cared for discipline, for grit, for the kind of person who endured storms in silence and still showed up the next day with her head high. Catherine passed every one of those tests without knowing she was being measured. And in Anne's reserved but powerful way, she began to support her, not with statements, but with trust. And that trust began to change everything. Outwardly, Catherine remained the same: loyal, composed, gracious. She continued to smile through appearances, nod through ceremonies, and wave as the cameras flashed. But behind palace walls, the tides had begun to shift. Her presence wasn't just noticed, it was felt. The Queen's staff, long conditioned to read between the lines, understood immediately. The monarch may have left the stage, but she had left someone behind to carry the light. And Catherine was already holding it. The monarchy, long struggling to find its anchor in the modern world, began gravitating toward her calm. She didn't demand it, she didn't announce it, but something was happening. Something that no royal proclamation could manufacture. A subtle but undeniable pull toward a new center of gravity. And Catherine, as always, stood still while history moved toward her. But while Catherine stood still, the earth beneath Camila was shaking because the Queen's will said nothing about the woman who had fought longest to be seen. Not a word, not a mention, not even a nod. In Queen Elizabeth's final private words, Camila had been erased, and she knew it wasn't by accident. For a woman who had clawed her way into public acceptance, weathered decades of headlines, and stood beside a king through the fire of scandal, the silence was more brutal than any insult. Camila, who once lived in the shadows of Diana's legend, had thought she had finally emerged. She had worn the crown. She smiled through the books. She had played the part of consort with calculated elegance. But now, with the Queen's secret will laid bare, the realization came crashing down. She had never been part of Elizabeth's final vision. Not once did her name appear. Not in tribute, not in warning, not even in formality. It was as though, in the Queen's eyes, Camila simply didn't exist. And that was the deepest wound of all, not rejection, but invisibility. Camila had lived through the impossible. She had endured the storm of public loathing, the glare of press obsession, the delicate balancing act of rehabilitating her image after years of being labeled the other woman. She had watched as royal tradition fought to keep her at arm's length, and still, she pressed forward. So, to be left out of the Queen's final testament wasn't just painful, it was personal. It felt like betrayal from beyond the grave, a subtle, deliberate erasure. And worse, it raised a question she couldn't shake. Had she ever truly been accepted? Whispers began to rise behind palace doors. Camila, once surrounded by a loyal team of advisors, began hearing unsettling words. Why had Anne been entrusted with the will? Why had this letter, this alleged will, been revealed now months after the Queen's passing? Was it simply timing? Or was it something darker, more calculated? Some suggested sabotage. Others murmured the unthinkable that this was Diana's revenge playing out from beyond, a masterstroke of legacy delivered by the Queen herself, using her private words and Diana's forgotten letter as weapons. Camila didn't respond, but the silence in her private quarters grew heavier. The laughter faded, the warmth dimmed. In public, Camila played the part flawlessly. She walked beside Charles. She smiled at ceremonies. She waved at crowds with the grace of a woman unbothered. But behind the curtain, things began to shift. Her presence in high-level meetings grew sparse. Her public engagements shortened. She appeared beside Catherine less and less, and when she did, the air between them was heavy, icy. Because Camila wasn't just watching Catherine rise, she was watching the monarchy realign around her. And for the first time since becoming queen, Camila felt like a guest at a coronation she hadn't been invited to. She began to retreat. Not dramatically, not with confrontation, but with a quiet withdrawal that spoke louder than any protest. She saw the way the staff looked to Catherine, how the tone of palace briefings changed, how the whispers on social media no longer mentioned Queen Camila, but a different name entirely. Catherine wasn't just favored, she was trusted. And trust, Camila knew, could not be inherited. It had to be earned. And now, she faced the truth she never wanted to admit: she may have the title, but not the legacy. But Camila wasn't the only one questioning the will, because what had once been private was now about to ignite the biggest royal legal debate in decades. It wasn't in probate, it wasn't in parliament, but it had the Queen's signature, and that made it more dangerous than law. It was the truth. The royal household, built on precedent and procedure, was never designed for disruptions of this kind. The Queen's secret, handwritten, emotionally charged, authenticated but unofficial, arrived like a thunderclap in a room full of whispers. For centuries, the monarchy had survived by following a process, by ensuring everything that mattered passed through the correct channels, signed by the right officials, read aloud in the right rooms. But this document, hidden for months and shared with only a handful of trusted hands, did none of that. It had no legal weight, but it carried something far more volatile: intent. Behind closed doors, royal legal teams convened in hushed urgency. The debate was immediate and brutal. Some argued that the will, despite its authenticity, was nothing more than a personal note, a heartfelt farewell from a monarch to her family. Others countered that the Queen had ruled longer than anyone in modern history and knew precisely what she was doing. She didn't leave behind a loophole. She left behind a message the monarchy couldn't afford to ignore. And at the center of it all were two women, Catherine and Diana, whose names carried the weight of destiny, not just tradition. The Queen's private will was authenticated beyond doubt. Her signature matched every known sample. The ink was dated, the parchment preserved. And the letter from Diana, kept hidden behind that will, was confirmed to be hers. There was no forgery, no dispute over origin, which made the silence around it even more deafening. Because as the lawyers bickered over clauses and jurisdiction, something else began to happen. The world found out, not through formal announcements or palace statements, but through leaks. The press got there first. Foreign outlets in France and Italy ran cryptic headlines about a secret testament and a letter from the late Princess of Wales. Then came the tabloids, then the broadsheets, and then social media. Snippets, phrases, unverified quotes from inside the Queen's hidden document began to surface. Catherine's name, Diana's warning, the Queen's phrase, the quiet force. It spread like wildfire. The palace tried to stay silent, but the public didn't. And with each leak, each rumor, the will transformed from a secret into a symbol. Public sentiment turned swiftly. Ignoring the Queen's private, will no longer look like protecting the crown. It looked like betrayal. Like smothering the voice of a monarch who had guided the nation for over 70 years. Polls shifted. Headlines grew louder. Legal scholars took sides, some arguing it was constitutionally meaningless, others saying it could set a precedent if embraced in spirit. Behind the walls of Buckingham and Windsor, arguments turned into panic. Some urged the family to bury the will forever, seal it away, erase the conversation. Others, more attuned to the rising wave of public emotion, warned that doing so could trigger something far worse, a revolt of trust. What began as a private discovery had now become a constitutional crisis. The monarchy wasn't just grappling with protocol, it was grappling with its soul. With what it meant to honor a queen not just as a ruler, but as a mother, a guide, a woman who, in her final act, chose to speak from her heart. And the weight of ignoring that voice was growing too heavy to bear. But outside courtrooms and corridors, something far more powerful was unfolding, and it was happening in the hands of the people. They didn't need a ceremony. They gave her a crown with hashtags. The public spoke not with ballots, but with belief. Catherine had become the people's queen. What began as murmurs in royal corridors had now erupted into a digital revolution. The will wasn't officially released, but it didn't need to be. Leaks, whispers, and fragments of its contents reached the internet like sparks finding dry grass, and within hours, the fire had caught. Across platforms, across borders, across generations, one name surged above all others: Catherine. Queen Catherine trended worldwide, not as a question, but as a declaration. TikTok reels and Instagram edits paired her poised demeanor with music that evoked triumph. Twitter exploded with threads connecting her subtle public service to the Queen's final words. YouTube documentaries dissected every frame of her royal appearances, reframing them as a quiet prophecy now fulfilled. In a monarchy bound by tradition, something radical was happening. Catherine wasn't being chosen by blood or by crown, she was being chosen by the people. It was the young who led the charge. A generation once thought disinterested in the monarchy suddenly found themselves moved, galvanized not by hierarchy, but by authenticity. Catherine's consistency, her humility, her complete absence of scandal, made her the perfect antithesis to everything that had once bruised the royal image. Her quiet dignity, once seen as reserved, was now hailed as powerful. She wasn't chasing attention, and that's what drew it. While others crumbled under headlines, Catherine endured, and the internet took notice. In a matter of days, social media had done what decades of royal PR could not. It transformed Catherine into a global symbol of grace. Edits of her consoling children, working behind the scenes, attending events without fanfare, all of it became digital gold. Public perception wasn't shifting, it was transforming. Polls began to reflect what the hashtags already knew. Charles's approval ratings slipped. Camila vanished almost entirely. Meanwhile, Catherine and William shattered popularity records, not just in the UK, but across the Commonwealth. But this wasn't just a popularity contest. This was a cultural reckoning. Because at its heart was something deeper in faith. Catherine had become a vessel of hope. Celebrities began referencing her in interviews. Influencers used her name in captions meant to inspire quiet strength. Major publications across Europe and beyond started publishing thin pieces with headlines like "The Queen We Were Waiting For" and "Catherine, the Crown's Silent Revolution." But perhaps the most telling shift came from the public themselves. The call wasn't just for admiration, it was for transparency. If this was the Queen's final wish, why was it being hidden? Why wasn't the palace speaking? Why weren't they honoring the voice of a monarch who had guided them through war, pandemic, and loss? The pressure built. Inside palace walls, silence became untenable. Every moment they withheld only amplified the wave outside. Catherine, however, said nothing. She remained steady. As the world erupted around her name, she carried on with quiet grace, attending engagements, as if nothing had changed. But everyone knew everything. The people had made their choice, not with coronets or ceremonies, but with unity, belief, and a digital crown forged in love. And as the world crowns Catherine in their hearts, the final piece of the Queen's hidden plan comes into view, and it changes everything we thought we knew. She never wore the crown, but she may have passed it. Diana's letter wasn't just a memory. It was a final move, and now, it's reshaping the monarchy. Long before she died, Diana saw it coming. Not the tragedy that would end her life, but the quiet unraveling of the institution she tried to modernize from within. In a letter now known only to a few and whispered about by millions, she poured out the warnings that had long haunted her about power being placed in the wrong hands, about image being valued over truth, and most importantly, about Camilla's creeping influence. But there was something else, something softer, more hopeful. Diana didn't just speak of fear, she spoke of faith. And her faith rested in someone who, at the time, was still only finding her place. Catherine, a name spoken not with desperation, but with quiet conviction. Diana saw something that few could, the potential for redemption in a woman who would never chase the spotlight, but would one day outshine it. When Queen Elizabeth read that letter, she didn't dismiss it. She preserved it, held it, reflected on it in silence through years of political storms and personal loss. And in her final moments of absolute privacy, she acted on it. She followed Diana's instincts, not as a sovereign clinging to protocol, but as a mother and grandmother who knew the difference between noise and truth. Elizabeth had ruled through decades of shifting public trust, watched the royal family stumble through scandal after scandal. And now, in her final act, she didn't just acknowledge the warning in Diana's words, she built her legacy around them. Diana had never spoken to the world in legal terms. She didn't leave statutes or decrees. But her letter was a map, one that pointed to a monarchy that could be reimagined not by birthright, but by character. She wrote not of thrones, but of bridges. She believed the future of the crown wouldn't be secured by bloodlines, but by the people who could connect tradition to the present people who didn't perform royalty, but lived it without effort. Elizabeth saw that same vision, and that's why, in her hidden will, she didn't just echo Diana's concerns, she transformed them into a plan. Charles read that letter with trembling hands. It wasn't a ghost that haunted him, it was the truth. The truth that Diana, in death, had the final say. Her voice, once silenced by institution and scandal, now thundered from beyond with more clarity than ever. And it cut through every defense he had left. It wasn't just about Camilla, it was about reckoning. About who had been right all along. The Queen's final testament wasn't cold or calculated. It was full of emotion, and yet beneath the maternal tone was the spine of steel Elizabeth had always been known for. She didn't divide her family. She defined its future. Her decision wasn't a rebellion, it was a resurrection. Diana's words, buried in silence for decades, had become prophecy. And now, in Catherine's rise, they were being fulfilled. In the end, Diana didn't need a crown to shape the monarchy. She needed only her voice. And that voice now lives on in the very woman she once dreamed would lead with grace, not grandeur. And in the Queen's final act, quiet and calculated, she didn't divide her kingdom. She prepared it for the one future she saw with absolute clarity. No scepter, no trumpet, just ink, trust, and a vision. Queen Elizabeth's true coronation wasn't her own, it was Catherine's. And now, the world finally sees it. The Queen didn't need to write the word Queen beside Catherine's name. She didn't need to spell out a succession plan or deliver a public endorsement. What she did instead was far more daring. She handed over the soul of the monarchy not with fanfare, but with faith. Her handwritten will, quietly stored and deliberately concealed, held no royal decree, but it held her heart. In that fragile parchment, she offered something that even crowns couldn't confer: trust. And trust, from a woman who ruled for 70 years without yielding, is the most sacred gift of all. Now, the burden rests on Charles, not of power, but of choice. He stands at the edge of two futures, one guided by protocol, the other by purpose. One that follows royal procedure to the letter, and one that honors the voice of the mother who believed the crown's survival depended on something more. He must choose whether to uphold the institution as it has always functioned, or whether to evolve it in the image of a legacy that is rapidly outpacing tradition. The weight of that decision is heavier than any crown he's worn. Because to honor Elizabeth's private wish is to shift the spotlight, maybe even the throne, away from himself. But to ignore it is to risk losing the very loyalty that gives the crown its power. And around him, the shift has already begun. William, always dutiful, always reserved, has not protested. He hasn't raised objections or made public declarations, but he's changed. Those close to him say his confidence in Catherine has deepened into something more profound reverence. He watches her with quiet admiration, stepping aside when the moment calls for it, letting her light define the future they once thought he alone would shape. Anne remains firm, her silence loud enough to fill the room. She was the first to know, the one the Queen entrusted from the beginning. She does not waver. She does not explain. She simply stands behind Catherine, and that alone speaks volumes. And then there's Camila, present but sidelined. Her crown, once a symbol of triumph, now feels heavier than ever. She wears it, yes, but it's no longer the future. The people no longer see her as the symbol of stability. That title, that presence, now belongs to someone else. And Camila knows it. She's not being pushed out, but she is being passed by. This is not a coup. This is not rebellion. It's something far more powerful. A quiet revolution. The kind only history can fully understand. The kind led not by ego or ambition, but by grace. Catherine is not fighting for power. She is not campaigning for authority. She is simply showing up, listening, leading, enduring. And in doing so, she is becoming something no title can define. The Queen saw it. The people see it. Even the palace now is starting to see it. In the deepest corners of the royal household, whispers remain of Elizabeth's final phrase uttered to Anne, written only once in that secret will, character before crown. It was not an instruction. It was a legacy. And Catherine has already begun living it, long before anyone ever thought to crown her. She's not waiting for the crown to come to her, it already has. And as the world moves forward, one truth remains. The Queen may be gone, but her last decision has just begun to reign. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.